Hi there, welcome back to the channel, playing The Lamps Are Going Out, World War I strategic scale. This is the third in a series of videos where I show the game evolving over time in the hope that it will help you to learn the games and some of the minutiae of the special rules as we play along. Each video I'm going to highlight the rules that are being introduced in the turn or in the game. In this video it is spring of 1915. In the game at least, and the couple of key things being introduced here. The one that I'll focus on first is trenches. It's the first time in the game that trenches can be built. There are a couple available in the game at the start of the game in 1914, but these are pre-built and they are there to act as defensive buffs in Verdun and the Rhine for the different sides. Now, when it comes to building these trenches, there's a few things to bear in mind. Firstly, it's done during the production phase, quite important. Secondly, it is done using production points. There is a cost to that of 2 production points for most factions. However, Germany do get to build a trench for a single production point, so Germany can build them more cheaply. Additionally, what you'll find is that although all 4 factions can build trenches, they are slightly more numerous for the Western Allies and Germany than they are on the Eastern Front and Turkey. And a couple of other things to bear in mind, for example, to do with the placement rules. You can have in any one area a maximum of 2 trenches. That maximum is reduced in mountainous regions. So, for example, Bohemia or the Rhine, you can only have 1 trench. You can only ever have 1 trench in the Middle East, in these square regions. In East Africa, there are no trenches permitted. That's this circle track down here. So there's certain differences in terms of locations, but in a general region, for example, Hanover, Berlin, the Ukraine there, you can have 2 trenches. Now, in order to build the second trench, you need to have a trench there in the region at the start of the game. Not the game, start of the turn. So you couldn't build 2 trenches in the Ukraine if you were Russia, unless you had already got a trench there at the start of the turn in which you built the second trench. However, Germany can always build 2. And that's in the same place, in the same turn. The other thing to bear in mind is that they need to be built in an area that is in supply over the land. So there's different types of supply in the game. There's land supply, so for example, the Somme there is supplied across the land through Belgium, Hanover into Berlin. However, the British Army here in Paris would be supplied through the land, then the sea to the British Isles. So there's different types of terrain that impact the supply, the oceans and the land. And for trenches, they have to be land supplied from a home area. Okay. Anything else? Actually, I think that's it in terms of placement. I think that's mostly it. Only thing to bear in mind is that if you do choose to land supply through a neutral area, it does cost you an additional production point to do that. We saw in the last video, maybe even the video before that, the benefit that trenches provide in terms of combat. So just to summarise quickly here, they add an extra defensive layer. You have to attack the trenches first, breach the trenches before you can go on and attack the defending land forces. The other thing that you need to bear in mind with trenches is if you do not successfully force a retreat, the trench flips back from its breached side to its unbreached side. And trenches, if the defending army or the owning army leaves an area with a trench, that trench stays behind. They're only removed if they are conquered by an opposing army. Okay, so that's trenches. That's a summary. Hopefully we'll see that as we play through the turn in itself. Okay, the other thing to bear in mind though is that we have for the first time the event deck build segment. What's it called? It's called the rebuild event deck segment. And basically what we do is we take the cards from the next year and add them to the cards that we've currently got in hand. So for example, and I'll just show this with Germany rather than anyone else, we currently have one card remaining in hand, one event card remaining. That's the 1914-15 card. What we now need to do in the turn is identify cards that say 1915 and onwards. So for example, we have in our big pile of event cards, we've got like a whole bunch of them, a range of cards that have 1915 on the corner there if it doesn't go too blurry. And we now add these to that remaining card and we give them a good shuffle, and that's our new event deck. Part of the game in fall 1914, you only had 3 cards to draw from, and 1915 we start to get a fair number more. And as we play through, each year you will have basically a growing number of cards left at the end. There's quite a lot of cards for each faction. And so what that means is some of the things that you will see in some games will not necessarily appear in others, adds a bit of variety and unpredictability to this retelling of the First World War. And we're now going to go and do that for the other 3 factions, and then we'll start the turn properly with the German factions go. Okay, I've created the deck for all 4 factions. The other thing to bear in mind when we do this is that there will be some cards potentially that carry over from previous turns that have an effect on the game. For example, this one here, which relates to a defensive marker placed on the British Army just there. And also there may be cards from a previous year that just get discarded without effect, or you may get an instruction on the card to draw another one, things like that, just to balance out. So what you may find is that a 1914 card gets drawn in 1917 as an example, and then it will vary what happens to that. But it is now Germany's turn, and so we will pull the event card and get this game underway. We have the Zeppelin and Gotha Rieds. This is a German card relating to the essentially air raid on the UK, and place the relevant token near the British Isles, which is this one here, I believe, and we will lose production based on our level of air technology as the British. However, and that varies. So, for example, it says here, if the Triple Entente, assuming that doesn't go blurry, if the Triple Entente player P technology, which is the air technology, is not active, they lose a production point during the next production phase for the Western Allies. If it is active, their overall level of air tech is reduced for this turn. Now, in this case, we do not have the air tech available to the British. Therefore, on the Western Allies production phase, we will lose a production point, and I'll signify that by placing the marker in the appropriate place on the British Isles. Okay, we now move on to movement. We still have the same challenge for the Germans that we had last time, really, but slightly better defended than we were before. The Eastern Front is quite vulnerable currently due to this build-up of Russian forces. However, we did have, well, we don't have the Western Front on a sort of a bit of a knife edge here around the edge of Paris. So do we move people from the Western Front to support the German army on the Eastern Front, or do we just leave it as it is and hope for the best in Germany? We can, of course, add extra forces during the production game. We've still got a fair number of units remaining that could be built for the Germans, and we could build those straight into the land areas there that the Germans are defending. And also, of course, we can have our trenches, which is also useful. So I think I will not move the Germans this turn. Moving into combat then, starting with naval combat. Now, I could have moved the units from here to here a minute ago. I chose not to because one is spent and I really don't want to lose another one. They cost an absolute fortune in production to replace. So I'm going to try to refit that fleet this turn and go back into the blockade box next turn. The ground combat will come after guerrilla combat, which is down here. And even though we've spent that particular unit down in the East African region can still perform guerrilla combat, and we will do by rolling a dice, aiming to get a 5 or a 6. And we've got a 1, so that was unsuccessful. Ground combat then, and we will start in Posen. We've got 3 units there in Prussia, occupying Prussia for the Russians, 2 in Poland. I think what we want to do in the first instance is try to reclaim our production site. So I will attack from Posen into Prussia. There's no offensive benefit to having trenches, so they're just a defensive buff. But I'll put these here just so we can see it fractionally more clearly than we could in the slightly congested board. Okay, so starting off with the Russian 6th Army against the German 8th Army. So Germany first, have a 3. It's not so good. We have no buffs to add to that at the moment as the Germans. And a 4 for Russia, which is a pretty poor result for the Germans, frankly. We'll move on to the 9th Army, attacking the same unit. It's a 2, diminishing returns here, versus a 6. Right, and that's where we'll stop for Germany. We don't want to waste our production points any more than necessary. So not much happened there from a German perspective. Okay, we didn't get any buffs for those combats because we don't have any tech that's relevant in that area, and we were unsuccessful both times, so no big push marker. So moving on into, let's do Verdun first, so I can show you what trenches do, just as a quick reminder regarding trench combat. And here we do have 3 units against 3 units with the French trench there, or the Western Allies trench. So the first thing we'll do is we'll have to attack the trench. And again, there's no modifiers, no buffs or anything here. So it's a 1 for Germany, which is appalling, and a 5 for the trench. So the Germans do lose that combat. Going again, I have a 2 for Germany, which is slightly better, but again, we need to roll for the trench, which is a 2. Now, the Germans have successfully breached that trench. So flip that marker over. The German unit would normally be spent because it's the attacker and they normally get spent. However, when you're attacking a trench, you're not spent. But on the flip side of that, you don't get the buff for a successful combat. So we will attack again, this time against France. And it's a 6 that time, that's much more like it. And a 3. So we are successful. The attacker is spent this time, but we do get the push marker, which means it's a +1. So we now have a 4 plus the 1 is a 5 against a 1. Cool. Okay, so the combat's done. Our 3 German units are spent. The attack limited the firepower of the French for the next turn, but overall didn't achieve all that much, to be honest. So the trench flips back to its unbreached side. The units have just rolled back in, and we move on to the next combat. And that is quite representative of how combat does roll in this game. Lots and lots of attrition where all you're really doing is limiting the firepower of the opponent for the next turn. Final part of the German combat phase then is here in the Somme. That unit was fresh. We have a whole bunch of stuff here. So what have we got? We have got Great Britain with a defensive buff. We also have artillery with a counter battery tech card applicable, which is gives it a defensive buff for the artillery as well as an offensive buff. And we're just going to roll the dice now and see what happens. But it's worth noting we are at something of a loss here with the Germans because we do not have enough men to take that position, I don't think, and be able to advance. We can force the enemy to be spent and therefore limit their counter-attack ability in the next turn. But ultimately, we're going to be kind of bashing our heads against a brick wall here as well, just like we were a moment ago. But first, let's attack and we'll see what happens. The air superiority is a defensive piece in this particular turn because we only have level 1 artillery. In fact, we don't have level 1 artillery at all, we only have the counter attack, the counter battery effect of the artillery. I'll explain that when we get further advanced with the tech tree, probably in another video. But anyway, Germany versus Britain. A 4 for Germany. We can roll for the Brits. You have a 2. The old Contemptibles marker here relates to this card, which says we can re-roll the defensive dice once. We rolled a 3, so no better, but ultimately the Germans have spent their unit. That card is removed from the game, as is the marker, and then we move down the roll, down the row even, or the column. Germany, the third army this time, that's a 5. They do get the +1, so that becomes a 6. The French will not use artillery because the best they can do is equal that, which will be automatically spent, but they have a 5, which is no good. And we'll do that again. We get a buff carries over, and that's a 1. Oh, that's a 2 because of the buff. And the French have a 6, so that is a spent force for the Germans. This next counter, which is the 6th army, to be honest, it doesn't really matter the names, they're just there for interest. The names, it could be a random German army. There's no difference between the 6th army and the 4th army in this game. But there you go. But one thing is different, because that was a failed attack by the previous counter. That does not apply. And we've rolled a 3. And I think the French will roll a single dice. No, that's a 1. That's a bit sucky. But now the Germans are down to their last counter, and we may as well attack again. It's a 4. They do get the big push marker because that was successful, so that becomes a 5. And then we roll for the French, which is a 3. Now, I have not used the counter battery card to use there, because what I wanted to do was save that to attack with on our turn shortly. So there's an option there to use the artillery in attack or defence if you have this card. Without that card, artillery can only attack. But once again, not much has happened on the Western Front. Lots and lots of fighting for very little progress on the German side, which kind of sums it up really, doesn't it, I suppose, the Western Front, in my relatively limited knowledge of these things. Okay, so German combat is done. Moving into production, the blockade box is owned by the British, so there's no change to standard production. We need to resolve any events. No events to resolve this time, because the German event drawn this turn is actually resolved on the British turn because of that particular card. U-boat attrition, it's 2 dice for each fresh U-boat, so I'll roll just the 2 dice because we only have 1 fresh U-boat, and I've rolled a 4, and a result of a 4 according to this table here is that this U-boat is spent if not central powered controlled, or Belgium is not spent central powered controlled, and Belgium is central powered controlled, so the U-boat remains fresh, which enables it to attack next turn, or during the British phase. Then we resolve any transferred production, but there is none for Germany, meaning we just take our production points and start to spend them. So we have 12 baseline for Germany from their different production sites, -1 because Prussia is controlled by the Russians, meaning we have 11 points to spend, and we have 2 here. 5 there, so that's 7 in total. 8, 9 and 10. And now I have a choice. Do I build another trench somewhere, or do I refit that? Given the issue here, I might imagine the plan originally was to build another unit, wasn't it? But let's pause there. Let's do a trench. I'm spending my last production point as Germany on a trench. Now the trench is land supplied because it's in German home territory, meaning we now have an extra layer of defences there for the Russians to get through before they can do any damage to the German forces there. All in all, not a bad turn for the Germans. Although we didn't get very far in terms of our attacks, we have limited the French and British ability to launch attacks of their own on their turn, and we've also got a trench in play. The only thing remaining is the air superiority and the technology. So tech first, and we've drawn a P3. Now this is the most advanced air technology card the Germans have available, but we cannot claim it because we only currently have the P1. We need to have the P2 in between. It's like a step process, and unfortunately the opponent does not have P3 to enable us to claim the difference. Final thing to do then is the air superiority, which would normally be 1 dice for our card here, but the other side do not have one, and my understanding, and it may not be correct, is that you would normally roll 1 dice per card, and if the enemy can't roll a dice, it's an automatic win, right? So the Germans are going to keep their air superiority counter, and it will stay, as far as I'm concerned right now, in the Somme region. Okay, British turn, or the Western Allies, as I should say. Event card first. Salonika. Okay, this is Greece. So Greece is a somewhat complex piece, but it's good that it's happened so early, because it means we can potentially launch attacks into Turkey a bit earlier than planned. So Salonika is an event which places this Salonika open counter in Greece. What it means is the Western army can move, the Western allies can move a single army into Greece. If they do so, they get to place a trench on the turn for free. And Greece becomes an ally, which means we can transfer production to it. It becomes an area we can legitimately retreat through, and so on and so forth. Now I am going to do that. I'm going to send a British unit to Greece. It's going to have to be this unit, because the other unit's spent. And I will place that trench for free as well, because trenches are quite expensive for the Western Allies. Now, there are various rules around Greece which we'll come into as we progress through. Greece can become neutral again. It can become a full ally, which has its army and so on. But ultimately, what it really is, in terms of the game at least, is a staging post towards attacking Gallipoli, which is just there. What we need to bear in mind as the Western Allies is that if Bulgaria and Serbia are both controlled by the Central Powers, and there are no Western Allies here, Greece flips back to neutral. That's basically the main thing you need to bear in mind. At the moment, it's not relevant, but something to bear in mind. Okay, so that goes over here for now. There's no real immediate effect other than what I've just done. And what I've just done, really, I've done two things at once. I've done the event card, and I've also done the first move. So now we need to think about a second move, if any, for the allies, and I probably won't do that. Movement is done then. So on to combat, and it's navy combat first, but there is none. We haven't moved those either. There's no amphibious invasion to think about, no beachheads, so straight to ground combat now. We do need to kind of build our forces up a bit here. We've got 4 units there that are spent, and 2 units there that are spent. That's most of our production resources gone already. There's going to be a limited production for the Brits. So I think what I'll do for this turn, I won't actually do any attacking with the Western Allies. I think I'll pause there and use this as an opportunity to rebuild our forces. So straight to production then. Blockade box doesn't matter in this turn, that's still owned by us. Events will be the negative production, so that's dropping the British production down to 6. And then we need to do the U-boat attacks. So same principle as with the U-boat attrition on the German turn. 2 dice, we roll an 11, which is unsuccessful according to that. So the British do have the full 6 production points, or what is now the full 6 production points. So we can get rid of that. But first the French. French will have 3 basic plus 2, so that's 5. And that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So they've refitted all their units, but not been able to do much else. The Brits will refit for 1. Refit for 2 down here, just in case Turkey decide to attack. Don't forget this is more expensive, and we've currently got 4 production points remaining. So I don't want to spend 2 or half of those points on the Middle Eastern situation just yet, because it's not a massive risk for us right now. It'd be better to spend those two points on a trench and put that trench into Paris, just here. And the other 2 points remaining, I probably need to build an army, don't I? Or transfer to the French. But first, let's build an army for the British. That has to go in the home area, just there. Cool. Western Allies' turn is done. No heavy artillery to reset. Technology card. I'm doing this slightly out of order in my haste. And we have heavy artillery. Okay, cool. So this one gives us an extra artillery. This is often the first card you draw in terms of the artillery, and it allows you to attack with 2 dice, picking the highest when you use it in combination with a land unit. But for right now, considering we already have the counter battery, we can add the extra land, the extra heavy artillery. So the Western Allies get 2, Russia get 1. Cool. Things are progressing quite nicely. So the Russians do have 2 counter battery, 2 unit batteries now. And I'll put 1 in Poland. And Western Allies actually have 3, which is kind of awesome, and they can all sit in Paris for now. Okay, cool. Nothing else to do right now. Moving on to the Russian turn and the Eastern Allies turn. Okay, open ocean policy. This is the USA entry track. We push it up by 1, the marker, if either U-boat is currently fresh. One of the U-boats is fresh, and the marker now moves to 1. So the USA comes into the war when that track reaches 8. Various things will impact that through the play of cards, and over the course of time we should see the US come in, but that won't be for a while yet, I wouldn't expect. Movement, I'll keep the forces, I'll keep them all, well, I kind of want to pile my forces into one region and attack from one region actually. Maybe I'll just move 1 there, just for now, and keep that one to defend. I will take the opportunity to move the artillery to the front line as well, although I won't get to spend it this turn, or to use it this turn. Anyway, it's there if we need it. Actually, that seems very silly. Let's move that there and place the artillery there in Posen as part of the attack. So the main thing we're going to do on this turn, we're going to attack into Posen from Prussia. So a reverse of what we did on the German turn. And I'll use this marker to show that. We have 2 trenches to get through this time. 3 German units. And we have some artillery as well for the Russians. So, if we're successful, the German war is going to be very, very difficult from here on in, because there's 3 production there. And this game is kind of won through production. Okay, so first attack, Russia against the German trench. Russia first has a 6, that is outstanding, against a 6. Attackers win ties unless there is defending air superiority, which is not in this case. Trench is breached. We now move on to the next trench with the same unit. A 5 for the Russians and a 3. So we've breached 2 trenches as 1 unit. That's fantastic. We're now going to attack the actual unit. This time we will use the artillery, so 2 dice. And we've got a 2 and a 6. We'll use the 6, thank you very much, against a 5. So that is successful. The artillery being spent. Big push marker comes in as we had a successful attack that was not against the trench. Russian attack is a 3 + 1, moving to a 4. German defenders roll a 4, and the Russians are on a roll here. Okay, last attack against the fresh unit. That's a 6 plus to a 7 and a 5. Oh, look at that. 1 more successful attack and we've taken Posen as the Russian army. Okay, let's see what happens. 6 plus 1, that's a 7 against a 2. Right, the Germans are having a bad day. They really are having a bad day. So what will happen is those German forces will need to retreat. They're going back to Berlin. The 2 trenches will actually need to be removed because the Russians can now move in as a minimum the army that attacked plus any number of other armies. The artillery will need to stay behind. This army can move forward, meaning that there's potential for Russia to take Berlin right now. And if that remains captured, the game will actually end on the next German turn. But before I worry about that attack then, just to note that those 2 trenches that were in Posen are both breached and they're overrun by the Russians and removed from the game. So let's do that attack then. The Russian Second Army against the spent German forces in Berlin. Rolling the dice, it's a 2 for the Russians and a 3 for the Germans. Wow, Germans are lucky that attack is spent. No further retreats. Combat phase over for the Eastern Allies. The only other thing we could possibly do, actually we can't because they're too far away. We can't really do anything here either, so let's not worry about that. But what we do need to do now is production. Much less to do here than there is for the Western Allies. Basically the Romanians, nope, the Serbian army are the one that's in play at the moment. So it's the Serbian army are currently sat in neutral Romania. Oh, that's confusing. But they don't get any production because Serbia has no production and they're conquered anyway. So the Serbian armies basically sit there until they can be absorbed into another army. The Russians have 4 supply points currently. So we'll just flip those 3 that are in Posen, plus I think the one in Prussia as well, just in case anyone decides to try and cut up that way. And then we flip the 2 artillery units back to their fresh side and move on to the Central Allies turn. And the event card is Mustafa Kemal, a Turkish officer, I assume, who gives a unit a +1 DRM when defending. There's a few of these different counters with various generals and other historical figures on them, and they will just sit on a unit until such time as they're needed. And that will give a buff in defence, as mentioned. Okay, so that's done. Movement. Movement. I think the Turkish army here will go there. So that would be my free move for Turkey. I'm going to keep that unit there for now, just as a buffer in case the Brits decide to attack. Yeah, I think movement's done. Don't think there's anything else to worry about. So straight into combat for the Central Allies. Poland is a sitting duck, and that's actually a really silly thing for the Russians to have done there, is to have left Poland unguarded. So it's a straight up die roll, 2+ wins, I believe. No, yeah, 2+, because the defensive standard for an empty area is 2 if there's no production or mountains. So it's a 2+ because the attacker wins twice. It's a 5, so there is a successful attack into Poland, and we will move forward anyone who wants to come with, which currently I think will be those two. Yeah, because we ideally want. Oh well. Now this is interesting. Normally the Central Powers, the Central Allies, cannot go into German territory. Can they reclaim German territory? That's an interesting question. Oh yes, I just checked the rules, and apparently they can advance after combat if they successfully recapture a German home area. However, if they reside in the German home area at the start of the movement phase, they must move. Basically, they have to move out, or they may move through or out of such areas so long as they don't go to another one. Yeah, so basically, they can recapture German territory, but they cannot stay in it effectively. They cannot move through it under normal circumstances. So, attacking into Prussia, we have 2 units attacking 1 with artillery. So the first Hungarian unit is a 4. The Russians will defend with 2 because of the artillery and the counter battery card, which is applicable to both the Western and Eastern Allies. I have a 6. Picking the highest one, so that is a failed attack, but that's spent. Final attack then, we have a 4 and a 2. So the Russians are spent, but the Austro-Hungarians are as well. But there's an interesting position here now for the Russians, because their next turn they're actually slightly sandwiched between 2 units here, and it wouldn't take much for the Austro-Hungarians to be able to go in there and push them out of Prussia. Okay, cool. That is everything. We just need to sort out production. Of course, the question is, do I attack into here? Every time I think I'm done, there's something else that crops up. Yeah, let's attack there, because there's going to be a retreat if that's the case. So, artillery plus a defensive army. Artillery and a regular army attacking a spent defensive army with artillery. So 2 dice for the Austro-Hungarians is a 5, and then 2 dice for the defending Russians because of the counter battery, and that's a 5. So it's a tie, meaning the Austro-Hungarians move in to that region, and forcing the Russians to retreat. Artillery don't advance with, but the artillery does retreat from an area. Cool. Okay, now that is definitely done. Production. Turkey gets 1 production point, which we'll use to flip the unit in Damascus. The Austro-Hungarians get 3. There's no production been transferred to them just yet, and those 3 production points will be used to flip those 3 units like that. Okay, we will leave 1 spent just there. No, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Let's leave that 1 spent, and that one can be fresh. Cool. Okay, end of the game, end of the turn, even end of the video. I'm getting confused. It's getting late over here, so the time has come to call this video to an end and say thank you for joining, and see you for for the next turn, which is the summer of 1915.